Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Billy Napier, the Florida Gators, going into 2025. It has to be one of, if not the most fascinating football team to watch in the 2025 year. And why do I say that? We've talked a lot about this football team going into 2025 from a roster standpoint. And when you look at that roster, there is so many reasons to believe that this Florida team can be one of the most dangerous teams, not only in the SEC. We're talking about one of the more dangerous teams in the entire country heading into 2025. Now, the driving force behind this optimism, yeah, it starts with quarterback DJ Lagway. I don't think this Florida team gets nearly enough credit in terms of how complete of a football team they are heading into 2025, where, yeah, you have your star quarterback in DJ Lagway, but you also return four out of your five starting offensive linemen. You return a phenomenal freshman running back in Jaden Baugh going into year two. You have some really interesting pieces around DJ Lagway from a pass catcher standpoint. And then you go to the defensive side of the football and say they return a good chunk of a defense that was playing like one of the best defenses in the country in the month of November. All to say that, one, from a roster standpoint, there's a lot to believe in for this Florida Gators team. The second half of the conversation, though, and the conversation that we haven't really gotten into quite yet, is what does the schedule look like for Florida in 2025? Now, look, as we get into this conversation, there's no way around it. This is one of the most difficult schedules that you see in the country. But the intriguing part for Florida is that there's not a game that I'm highlighting in red. In previous years, there would be a few games on the Florida Gators schedule that you just say, yeah, you can chalk that one up as a loss, probably not winning that football game. There's not a team in the country that I don't think Florida can beat. And you look at the hardest game of the schedule, probably Texas on October 4th. You get Texas at home. And so you're suddenly looking at the schedule and say, yeah, it's really hard, but you're not really counting Florida out in a lot of these football games. And if this Florida team can kind of turn the corner, kind of like we saw them turn the corner in 2024 and become a program that can win these kind of football games consistently, this is going to be a really fun year for Florida in 2025. Now, there's a couple of really intriguing matchups, and there's a couple intriguing portions of the schedule that I want to get into a little bit more before we do. And as always, to the Florida fans, appreciate you guys. Y'all know I'm really high on this football team heading into 2025, and the amount of support y'all have shown the fellas in the months of February and March means the absolute world. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And, before I give my takes on this schedule, I would love to hear the expectations that the Florida fans have going into 2025, where you look at the win total and say 6.5 games. And so you're cashing out 7-5. That is achieving your win total. To be quite frank, the way I look at it, the way I look at this football team, a 7-5 year would be a disappointment for Florida. Now, I have higher expectations for Florida in the 2025 year. Now, I don't think I want to get into the official prediction, so to speak, in terms of what this Florida team will be, because I think there's a lot to play out in spring practice. I think there's a lot to play out in the spring transfer portal. So we'll give the official prediction coming up in the summer. But I look at it and say, at the very least, I expect 8 wins. I think 9-3 probably gets you to the college football playoffs with how difficult this schedule is. So Florida fans would love to hear just the early expectations that you have for this football team in 2025 in the comment section. There are two things that jump out. One we kind of talked about, and that is there's just not a game where I am not giving Florida a chance to win. Now, it's not to say Florida is going to be favorites in every single one of these football games. You go on the road to play LSU, you play Georgia neutral site, you play Texas on October 4th. Those are some games that Florida might be slight underdogs in. But I don't think I'm looking at this schedule and saying they don't have a chance to win those games. The second thing that intrigues me is it's a front-loaded schedule where you have two cakewalks with Long Island and USF. If Florida's nearly as good as we think they are, they should win those games comfortably. On the road at LSU, on the road at Miami, Texas on the road at Texas A&M, all before the weather starts to change, all before we really even hit that kind of fall feeling in the air. That is a very difficult early portion of the schedule. What intrigues me about Florida is this is probably how I would prefer it if I'm a Florida fan. Like, yeah, I could understand the argument of, hey, we want an easy first month of the schedule, build some momentum going into the month of October before our schedule gets hard. To me, I don't want that for Florida, because you look at Florida and say ton of returning production, ton of momentum that they've built up late in the month of November in the 2024 year. Returning production matters pretty generally in college football. Where I think returning production means the most is in the early games, because a lot of teams that don't have a ton of returning production, they might have a decent roster, but they got a lot of new faces that are probably going to go through some growing pains. I don't think Florida is going to go through some of those growing pains. So you look at that game at LSU, where LSU has to break in a brand new offensive line by week 3 of the season, going up against a Florida front seven that I think can be very good. I would prefer to play LSU early in the season before that offensive line gets their feet under them. And then you look at on the road at Miami. I mean, that's going to be a very intriguing game where you got a transfer portal quarterback in Carson Beck that sounds like won't be participating at all in spring practice. If you're a Florida fan, you probably prefer to play Miami early than later in the schedule. And so I look at it and say, you start the season 2-0. The way I probably look at it is if you can come out of the first 4 games 3-1 going into the bye week, I think that would be good for Florida. You got 2 massive toss-ups in LSU and Miami. I think I'm intrigued with that LSU matchup because the question marks we might have with LSU's offensive line. Where you look at Florida specifically, the way they were playing in the back half of November, where this was a dominant defensive line that even dominated an LSU offensive line that was pretty dang good last year. That's a matchup that might favor Florida a little bit. Texas is going to be tough. Texas has 2 new starting tackles, obviously a new quarterback in Arch Manning. I think Texas is going to be a very good football team. But if you're 4-1 coming off the bye, getting Texas at home, that in Arch Manning, look, we think Arch Manning is going to be a very good football player, very good quarterback, still a young quarterback with not a ton of experience going on the road to Gainesville, Florida. That's something that I think should intrigue Florida fans. You go on the road to play Texas A&M. That is never an easy place to play. You should comfortably beat Mississippi State. Georgia is a game that historically you kind of highlight that game in red. That's not how I approach the Georgia Bulldogs going into the 2025 year, where you look at Georgia and say you replace a lot of guys on the offensive line from a unit that was just underwhelming in the 2024 year. You have a new quarterback. We think it's going to be Gunnar Stockton. On defense, you not only replace a lot of really good football players on this Georgia defense, guys like Jalen Walker, guys like Micah Williams. The question I have for Georgia, which we're not used to having, is, all right, who are the game wreckers that Georgia has on the defensive line? You know, historically, it's always been like, even when they lost a guy like Jordan Davis, they had a guy like Jalen Carter. Even when they lost a guy like Jalen Carter, they had a guy like Micah Williams. I look at it this year and say, I don't know if Georgia is as physically imposing and as physically dominant along the line of scrimmage as we're used to talking about Georgia in the preseason. That is not a game that you don't give Florida a very good chance of winning. On the road at Kentucky should be a win. I'm not very high on Kentucky going into this year. On the road at Ole Miss, I highlighted it in purple. But I look at that match and say, you beat a really good Ole Miss team last year. You look at Ole Miss going into this year and say, one, you have to replace Jackson Dart. I know there's a lot of optimism around a familiar name for Florida fans in Austin Simmons. And I guess what I would say there is, even if Austin Simmons is a 1-for-1 with Jackson Dart, he's as good as Jackson Dart, which is a very big if. Ole Miss is not as good at any other position on the football field as they were in 2024. the defensive line loses legitimate top 50 NFL draft picks, a couple of them. You look at the offensive line, you have some turnover there. You lose guys like Trey Harris and Juice Wells on the outside. This is an Ole Miss team that was really good last year, was quite frankly, a national championship caliber roster. They're just not going to be as good of a football team. And so I highlighted it in purple because you go on the road to an Ole Miss team that we know can beat just about anybody in the country. But you feel good if you're a Florida fan going into that matchup. You get Tennessee at home. You end with Florida State, which should be a win. The question is, what is the record that gets Florida into the college football playoffs? I would say 9-3. Now, go back to last year. The SEC teams that went 9-3, Ole Miss, Alabama, South Carolina, they all were on the outside looking in when it came to the college football playoffs. That might change in the 2025 year because look at the teams that the playoff committee put in above those SEC teams. Teams like Indiana, teams like SMU, and then look at how they did in the college football playoffs. Not very good. Wouldn't be surprised if the results that we saw in the college football playoffs last year from teams that had really good records but did not play very hard schedules, wouldn't be surprised if they kind of flip that and say, hey, we're going to leave out a team like SMU and Indiana, and we're going to put in a 9-3 SEC team that went through a gauntlet of a schedule. And if Florida goes 9-3, when you play out of conference at Miami, you play out of conference Florida State, and you play teams like Texas and Georgia at LSU, 9-3 should get Florida into the college football playoffs. And I do think it's a very obtainable goal for Florida. There's not a game that you are chalking up as a loss. You got about 6 toss-up games. If you can win 3 or 4 of them, this is a team that can make the college football playoffs and be dangerous in the college football playoffs. To me, my expectations for Florida as a football team in 2025 are significantly higher than what Vegas is telling us their win total is. That's kind of how I think it should be for Florida fans too. This is a team that can be really dangerous, and the expectations are high. 9-3 should get them into the college football playoffs. We'll pause it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. We'll get into our official predictions as that summer rolls around because Florida might make some changes in that spring transfer portal window, but the other teams around them could as well. The other teams on this schedule could. So we'll get into the official predictions in the summer. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.